Close your eyes for a moment and imagine yourself waking up not in the comfort of your bed, but on a rough, straw mat, in a world where the sounds of wild nature echo outside your humble dwelling. The air is thick, heavy with humidity and invisible dangers. You've just awakened in ancient India, a land that seems straight out of fairy tales, but which hides brutal realities capable of transforming your sweetest dreams into the most terrifying nightmares. Welcome, time adventurers, to another journey through the darkest corners of human history. Today, we're going to dive deep into the turbulent waters of one of the world's oldest and most fascinating civilizations, ancient India. But forget everything you've seen in Bollywood movies or modern media romanticizations. The reality we're going to unveil today is much rawer, much more dangerous, and infinitely more challenging than any fiction could imagine. You're about to embark on a journey that will shake your perceptions about the past and make you kiss the ground of the modern era. We'll discover together why even the bravest time adventurers couldn't survive even 24 hours in this ancestral land, where every breath was a conquest and every dawn a miracle. Prepare to discover a world where tigers made nocturnal visits to villages, where a simple headache could be a death sentence, and where your social position determined not only how you would live, but whether you had the right to live. This is the real story of ancient India, stripped of romanticizations and presented in all its fascinating brutality. Before we begin this adventure through time, leave your like if you're prepared to discover truths that will forever change your perspective on modern life. Comment below which aspect of ancient life scares you most, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel because we have many more time travels waiting for you. Now, let's go back in time and discover why you definitely wouldn't last a full day in ancient India. The first ray of sun hasn't yet touched the horizon when you're brutally torn from sleep. Not by a gentle alarm clock or the soft morning light, but by the distant roar of a predator that might be just meters from your door. This is your first awakening in ancient India, and already in the first seconds you realize this is not a place for the faint of heart. The darkness of dawn isn't just the absence of light, it's a mantle of invisible dangers that extends everywhere. You need to wake up before sunrise, not by choice, but out of survival necessity. The heat of the coming day will be so intense it could literally kill you if you're not prepared. Temperatures could easily exceed 45 degrees Celsius, transforming the air into a furnace that burns your lungs with every breath. But heat is only the first of an endless series of challenges you'll face before even taking your first sip of water. Speaking of water, forget your kitchen faucet. Here, every drop of water is a matter of life and death. You need to walk kilometers to the nearest river, facing treacherous terrain and the constant threat of predators. And when you finally find water, it will probably be contaminated with parasites and bacteria that can kill you within days. Morning rituals aren't just cultural traditions, they're matters of extreme survival. You must purify yourself not only spiritually, but physically, using primitive techniques that can barely remove visible dirt, let alone the deadly microorganisms hiding on every surface. These purifications involve bathing in rivers frequently polluted by animal carcasses and human waste, creating a vicious cycle of contamination that decimated entire communities. And then you discover something that can determine whether you live or die today: your caste. This isn't just a social concept, it's a system that can literally decide whether you have the right to food, clean water, or even if you can seek shelter when natural elements turn against you. If you were born into a low caste, your life expectancy drops dramatically. If you're an untouchable, your existence is considered so impure that your mere presence can contaminate others, leading to punishments that include beatings or even death. Work begins before dawn and doesn't end until long after sunset. 5-year-old children already carry responsibilities that modern adults would consider unbearable. In agriculture, you work under the scorching sun without protection, using primitive tools that destroy your body with each use. In crafts, you inhale toxic substances daily, reducing your life expectancy with each breath. In commerce, you face bandits, wild animals, and extreme weather conditions just to transport goods from one city to another. But perhaps the most terrifying aspect of daily life is the constant threat of invasions. Nomadic groups attack regularly, not just to plunder, but to conquer territories. These invasions aren't organized wars with rules and codes of honor, but they're brutal massacres where mercy is seen as weakness. Women and children are enslaved, men are killed or forced into labor that is essentially death sentences, and entire cities disappear from the map in a single night. Communication between communities is practically non-existent, which means an attack could be approaching and you wouldn't have any idea until you hear the neighbor's screams. There are no warning systems, no organized military forces for protection, and certainly nowhere to run when danger approaches. Your only defense are primitive weapons that require physical strength and proximity to the enemy, a guaranteed recipe for brutal and quick death.
Now that you've survived the first hours of morning, it's time to face one of the most brutal and inescapable aspects of life in ancient India, the caste system. This isn't simply a social system, it's an invisible prison that determines every aspect of your existence, from what you can eat to when you can die. Imagine discovering that your social position wasn't determined by your actions, achievements, or character, but by the mere chance of birth. And even more terrifying, this position is immutable. No matter how intelligent, talented, or virtuous you might be, if you were born into a low caste, you'll die in a low caste. This crushing reality created a society where hope was a luxury most couldn't afford to have. The untouchables lived in conditions that would make any modern person question humanity itself. They were forced to live literally outside cities, in areas where not even wild animals dared enter. Their houses were little more than improvised shelters made from discarded materials, offering zero protection against the elements or predators. During monsoons, these structures were frequently swept away by floods, taking entire families to brutal and anonymous deaths. The untouchables' professions included handling corpses, cleaning human waste, and working with leather, all activities considered so impure that simply touching them could contaminate someone of higher caste. This contamination wasn't just a social matter. Breaking these rules resulted in brutal physical punishments. Public beatings were common, and in more serious cases, death was considered appropriate punishment for simply existing in the wrong place. Women faced a double curse. Besides caste restrictions, they dealt with a deeply misogynistic system that treated them as property. Marriages were commercial arrangements where 12 or 13-year-old girls were handed over to much older men in exchange for cattle, land, or political alliances. These children had no voice in the decision that would determine the rest of their lives, frequently very short lives. Domestic violence wasn't just tolerated, it was expected. Women who didn't produce male children were frequently abandoned or killed. During childbirth, which happened without any real medical assistance, mortality was astronomically high. If the mother died, the baby usually followed. If the baby died, the mother was frequently blamed and punished for her failure. The concept of social mobility was literally unthinkable. If you were born a farmer, your children would be farmers, and their children too. This rigidity created stagnant societies where innovation and progress were practically impossible. any attempt to change professions or question the system resulted in complete ostracization, a social death sentence that frequently led to physical death. Slavery existed in disguised forms throughout society. People from low castes were frequently loaned or sold to work in conditions that differed very little from traditional slavery. They worked without payment, lived in inhumane conditions, and had no legal rights. If they tried to escape, they were hunted like animals and punished in ways that defy imagination. Punishments for social transgressions were disproportionately brutal. Simply looking directly at someone of higher caste could result in having your eyes removed. Speaking when not requested could lead to tongue removal. These weren't punishments reserved for serious crimes, they were consequences for simply existing in a way that challenged the established social order. Education was an exclusive privilege of higher castes, creating a perpetual cycle of ignorance and dependence. Without access to knowledge, lower castes couldn't develop skills that could improve their conditions or question the system that oppressed them. This forced ignorance was a more effective tool of social control than any chain or prison. If you thought the caste system was your biggest challenge, prepare to face an even deadlier and more relentless enemy: diseases. In ancient India, a simple cut on your finger could be the beginning of prolonged agony that would end in death. Every injury, no matter how small, was potentially a death sentence in disguise. Malaria wasn't just a disease, it was a force of nature that decimated entire communities during rainy seasons. Mosquitoes weren't seen as disease carriers, that knowledge was still centuries in the future. Instead, malaria was attributed to evil spirits or divine punishments. Treatments included elaborate rituals that not only failed to cure the disease, but frequently accelerated the patient's death through practices like excessive bleeding or ingestion of toxic substances. The bubonic plague arrived like a storm of death, transforming prosperous cities into open-air cemeteries within weeks. The symptoms were so grotesque that people preferred to isolate themselves completely rather than seek help. Buboes the size of eggs appeared in necks, armpits, and groins, growing until they exploded into purulent wounds that attracted flies and other insects. The pain was so intense that many patients preferred death to continued suffering. Cholera transformed healthy people into dehydrated corpses within hours. Diarrhea and vomiting were so severe that victims literally emptied themselves to death. Without understanding of hydration or electrolytes, treatments frequently accelerated the death process. Entire families were decimated in a single day, leaving villages deserted and full of decomposing corpses. The doctors of the time were a dangerous mixture of charlatans, healers, and genuinely well-intentioned but fatally misinformed people. Surgery was performed without anesthesia. Imagine having a limb amputated completely conscious, feeling every cut of the primitive saw through bone. Many patients died of shock during the procedure, this frequently being considered a merciful death compared to what would come after. The absence of knowledge about germs and infections meant that surgical instruments were rarely cleaned between patients. A knife used to remove an infected tumor was used on the next patient without any sterilization. This created infection outbreaks that spread like fire through communities, killing far more people than the original diseases. Ayurvedic treatments, while based on genuine observations about plants and herbs, were frequently misapplied or mixed with dangerous superstitious practices. Medicinal plants were regularly confused with their poisonous counterparts, leading to accidental poisonings. Additionally, Dosages were determined by divination or rituals, not scientific knowledge, resulting in fatal overdoses or ineffective underdoses. Intestinal parasites were constant companions of practically the entire population. Worms grew to meters in length inside intestines, causing severe malnutrition, constant pain, and eventual death by intestinal obstruction. Treatments included ingesting even more toxic substances than the parasites themselves, creating a vicious cycle of poisoning and infection. Child mortality was so high that having a child survive to age 5 was considered a divine miracle. Mothers frequently gave birth to 8 or 10 children, hoping that perhaps 2 or 3 would survive to adulthood. Childbirth itself was a death lottery performed by midwives without medical training, using primitive instruments in completely unsanitary conditions. Average life expectancy was brutally low, rarely passing 30 years for the general population. This wasn't just due to diseases, but also to the deadly combination of malnutrition, extreme physical labor from childhood, and constant exposure to environmental toxins. People who managed to reach 40 were considered venerable elders, frequently so debilitated by decades of illness that they could barely move. Epidemics swept the subcontinent regularly, some so devastating that entire cities were abandoned by the few survivors. Without understanding of quarantine or disease containment, these epidemics spread with terrifying speed. One infected person could contaminate hundreds of others before symptoms manifested, creating waves of death that seemed endless.
But diseases were just one of the deadly threats you'd face daily. The wild nature of ancient India wasn't a picturesque scenery for contemplation. It was a battlefield where humans were frequently the prey, not the predators. Every step outside the relative safety of human communities was potentially the last step you'd take. Tigers weren't exotic animals seen only in zoos. They were deadly neighbors who regularly visited villages looking for an easy meal. An adult tiger can jump more than 3 meters high and run at 60 kilometers per hour. They hunted mainly during dusk and dawn, exactly when you needed to move to perform essential tasks like fetching water or checking crops. A single tiger could terrorize an entire community for months, killing not only humans, but also the cattle essential for survival. Leopards were even more dangerous because they were better climbers and could attack from practically any angle. They frequently entered houses during the night, killing people while they slept. Their silent footsteps and ability to move through trees made them phantom predators who could be watching you from meters away without you ever knowing. Wild elephants, despite their majestic appearance, were responsible for more human deaths than tigers and leopards combined. During mating season, male elephants became extremely aggressive, attacking anything they perceived as a threat. An adult elephant weighs more than 5 tons and can run at 40 kilometers per hour. Being trampled by an elephant wasn't a quick death. Frequently, victims remained conscious long enough to feel every bone breaking. Snakes were a constant and invisible threat. Venomous snakes hid in grain baskets, water wells, and even in beds. The cobra and Russell's viper were particularly lethal, with venoms that could kill a healthy adult in less than an hour. Without antivenoms or adequate medical treatment, a snake bite was frequently a slow and agonizing death sentence. Insects weren't just annoyances, they were armies of flying death. Swarms of mosquitoes carried not only malaria, but also dengue, yellow fever, and other diseases that could decimate entire populations. Tsetse flies transmitted sleeping sickness, a condition that drove victims to madness before death. Fleas carried the bubonic plague, transforming into miniature agents of apocalypse. Monsoons, which we now see as a natural climatic phenomenon, were biblical proportion events that could destroy years of work in hours. Tranquil rivers transformed into murderous torrents that swept away not just houses, but entire villages. People who managed to escape floods frequently died from waterborne diseases in the following days. On the other hand, droughts were equally deadly, but in a slower and more psychologically torturous way. Wells dried up, crops died, and animals migrated or died, leaving human communities without resources. During great droughts, cannibalism became a desperate reality, with families being forced to make unthinkable decisions to survive. Earthquakes struck without warning, toppling primitive structures that offered little protection. Without earthquake-resistant construction systems or knowledge about tectonic plates, entire communities could be buried in minutes. Survivors were frequently trapped under debris for days, dying slowly from dehydration and injuries. Hunting wasn't a sport or hobby, it was a survival necessity that required you to risk your life regularly. Armed only with primitive spears and rudimentary bows, you needed to approach animals that were faster, stronger, and better armed by nature than you. A wounded boar could easily kill an inexperienced hunter with its sharp tusks. Even apparently harmless animals like deer could cause serious injuries with their antlers or hoofs. Navigating through wild terrain was a skill that took decades to master. And even then, experienced people regularly got lost and died from exposure. Without maps, compasses, or reliable reference points, a journey of a few kilometers could transform into a deadly odyssey lasting weeks. Many travelers were found years later, their bones scattered by predators as silent reminders of the dangers of underestimating wild nature. Surviving predators and diseases was just the beginning. Now you face a challenge that literally consumed every waking moment, finding safe food to eat. In ancient India, every meal was a gamble with death, and hunger was a more relentless enemy than any tiger or epidemic. Food scarcity wasn't an occasional occurrence, it was a constant reality that shaped every aspect of life. Even during good years, food was so scarce that families needed to make impossible decisions about who would eat and who would go hungry. During bad harvests, entire communities faced the real prospect of death by starvation within weeks. Water, this basic element of life, was probably the biggest silent killer of the time. There was no concept of potable versus contaminated water. You drank from the same source where animals drank, bathed, and died. Rivers served simultaneously as sources of drinking water, sewage systems, cemeteries for animals and humans, and bathing places. This deadly soup of pathogens guaranteed that practically the entire population suffered from some form of waterborne disease. Refrigeration was a completely unknown concept, which meant all food began rotting the moment it was harvested or slaughtered. In India's shotting heat, fresh meat became toxic within hours. Fruits and vegetables fermented quickly, producing alcohols and toxins that could cause everything from mild intoxication to death by poisoning. Entire families regularly died from eating food that had rotted only slightly. Grains, when available, were frequently infested with fungi that produced deadly mycotoxins. Ergotism caused by fungi in rye and other grains caused hallucinations, convulsions, and agonizing death. People who consumed infected grains frequently developed gangrene in limbs, which literally rotted while they were still alive. The pain was so intense that many preferred to amputate their own limbs with primitive tools. Identifying edible versus poisonous plants was a life-or-death skill that took years to master. Many nutritious plants had toxic counterparts that were almost identical in appearance. Entire families died from confusing edible mushrooms with deadly varieties. Children were particularly vulnerable, frequently eating attractive berries or roots that were lethally poisonous. Dependence on monsoons for agriculture created a cycle of abundance and famine that could change dramatically from one year to another. If rains came too early, late, or in wrong quantities, entire crops were lost. Without effective storage systems or reliable trade networks, a bad harvest in one region meant guaranteed famine for everyone in the area. Pests were another constant nightmare that could destroy months of hard work in days. Clouds of locusts could descend on cultivated fields and devour them completely, leaving only bare earth. Rats and other rodents not only ate stored grains, but also contaminated them with urine and feces, making them unfit for human consumption. Food rituals, while culturally important, frequently created additional health risks. Certain rituals required prolonged fasting that could dangerously weaken the immune system. Other rituals involved consuming specific substances that could be toxic or contaminated. Social pressure to participate in these rituals meant people frequently risked their lives to maintain their position in the community. Spices, which we now associate with the richness of Indian cuisine, were frequently adulterated with dangerous substances to increase weight and profit. Unscrupulous sellers mixed expensive spices with dirt, animal excrement, or even toxic substances like lead. These adulterations not only stole nutritional value, but frequently poisoned consumers. During periods of extreme famine, which occurred regularly, people were forced to consume practically anything that could provide calories. This included tree bark, bitter roots, and even mineral-rich earth. Many of these emergency substances caused serious digestive problems, malnutrition, and frequently death by intestinal obstruction or poisoning. Competition for food resources created constant conflicts between communities. Entire groups migrated in search of food, frequently invading other groups' territories and creating bloody wars for access to cultivated land or water sources. These resource wars weren't organized conflicts with rules. They were desperate battles where mercy was a luxury no one could afford.
As if all natural dangers weren't enough, you still need to face the most unpredictable and brutal of all predators, other human beings. Violence in ancient India wasn't an occasional aberration, it was a constant that permeated all aspects of life, from personal conflicts to wars that redesigned entire maps. Invasions didn't arrive with diplomatic warnings or formal declarations of war. Nomadic tribes descended from mountains or crossed deserts like storms of destruction, attacking settlements without provocation or negotiation. These invasions were survival enterprises for attackers and death sentences for the attacked. There were no rules of war, no protection for non-combatants, and certainly no mercy for the defeated. Invaders weren't interested only in material wealth. They needed slaves, cultivable land, and resources their own lands couldn't provide. This meant successful invasions resulted in complete obliteration of attacked societies. Men were killed or enslaved, women were taken as spoils of war, children were separated from their families to be raised as soldiers or slaves, and elderly were simply killed for being considered useless. The weapons of the time were designed not to kill quickly, but to inflict maximum pain and terror possible. Swords were frequently serrated to cause wounds that didn't heal easily. Spears were barbed, so they were impossible to remove without causing even greater damage. Bows fired poisoned arrows that guaranteed slow and agonizing death, even for apparently minor wounds. The lack of organized military forces meant each community was on its own when attacks came. Groups of farmers armed with agricultural tools faced experienced warriors equipped with weapons of war. The result was frequently a one-sided massacre that left entire villages deserted within hours. Looting wasn't organized military operations. They were frenzies of violence where anything of value was taken and any resistance was punished with extreme brutality. Houses were burned not just to destroy evidence, but to create psychological terror that would discourage future resistance.
temples and sacred places were purposefully desecrated to break the morale of conquered populations. Justice was dispensed not by impartial tribunals, but through physical combat or trials that frequently resulted in death. The concept of an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth was applied literally, resulting in endless cycles of revenge that could last generations. Entire families were exterminated for crimes committed by a single member, creating miniature genocides that repeated constantly. Human sacrifices weren't rare religious aberrations. They were common practices associated with important events like coronations, temple construction, or attempts to appease gods during natural disasters. These ceremonies frequently involved elaborate tortures designed to maximize the victim's suffering, based on the belief that greater suffering would result in greater divine favor. Bandits and highway robbers operated with complete impunity in vast areas where there was no central authority. Travelers were routinely tortured not just to reveal the location of hidden treasures, but because torture itself was considered entertainment. Commercial caravans needed to travel in armed groups, transforming every commercial journey into a military expedition. Domestic violence was not only tolerated, but legally protected. Husbands had legal right of life and death over wives and children. Regular beatings were considered necessary to maintain family discipline. Children who didn't meet expectations were frequently killed or abandoned, especially girls, who were seen as economic burdens. Disguised slavery permeated the entire social structure through debt systems that were impossible to pay off. Entire families became effective property of creditors for generations, working in conditions that differed little from traditional slavery. Escape attempts resulted in punishments that included mutilation, branding with hot iron, or public death as an example to others. Territorial conflicts were constant and brutal, fueled not only by resource needs, but by religious and cultural differences that were seen as incompatible with coexistence. Different ethnic groups engaged in wars of extermination that aimed not just to defeat, but to completely eliminate entire cultures. These ethnic wars created waves of refugees who frequently died of hunger, disease, or violence before finding safety. The absence of standardized legal systems meant justice was frequently determined by brute force or political influence. Criminal accusations were decided through ordeals that included walking on burning coals, holding hot iron, or submerging in water for impossible periods. Surviving these ordeals was considered proof of innocence, but most victims died during the process, making justice a disguised death sentence. And so, we reach the end of this terrifying journey through the deadly dangers of ancient India. After exploring every aspect of this fascinating but brutal civilization, one thing becomes crystal clear. You definitely wouldn't last 24 hours in this ancestral world. Think for a moment about everything we discovered together. From the moment you would wake before dawn to avoid the deadly heat of day, to facing predators who considered humans just another meal option. We explored a social system so rigid and cruel that it determined not only how you would live, but whether you had the right to life. We dove into the terrifying realities of diseases that transformed minor wounds into death sentences, and discovered how every meal was a gamble with your own mortality. We saw how wild nature wasn't a bucolic scenery for contemplation, but a battlefield where humans were frequently the prey. We explored how the daily search for safe food consumed every waking moment, with hunger being a more relentless enemy than any predator. And finally, we discovered how human violence permeated all aspects of life, from domestic conflicts to wars that redesigned entire civilizations. Now, as you're watching this video in the comfort of your home, with instant access to potable water, refrigerated food, medicines that can cure deadly infections in days, and legal systems that protect your basic rights, can you really comprehend the abyss that separates our era from the brutal reality of the past? Every time you turn on a faucet and clean water comes out, You're experiencing a miracle that billions of people in history never knew. Modern medicine, which we take for granted, represents thousands of years of human progress. That aspirin you take for a headache could literally save your life in ancient India, where headaches were frequently symptoms of deadly diseases. The antibiotics that cure your throat infection in a week would have been considered divine magic by people who saw minor infections kill healthy people within days. Our understanding of nutrition, hygiene, and disease prevention represents a silent revolution that has saved more lives than all the wars in history combined have destroyed. The simple act of washing hands with soap, something so basic we do without thinking, would have saved millions of lives throughout human history. The human rights we consider fundamental, freedom of movement, protection against violence, access to education, equality before the law, are relatively recent achievements in human history. The idea that all human beings are born with equal dignity, regardless of their origin, gender, or social position, would have been revolutionary and dangerous in ancient India. How has our perspective on our everyday problems changed after this journey? That complaint about traffic on the way to work seems so insignificant compared to the prospect of being hunted by tigers during a kilometers-long walk to fetch contaminated water. That frustration with slow internet pales before the reality of living in a society where information and knowledge were exclusive privileges of a small elite. But perhaps the most important lesson of this journey is to develop deep gratitude for the advances our species has conquered through millennia of struggle, suffering, and gradual progress. Each generation built upon the sacrifices and discoveries of the previous one, slowly creating the modern world that allows not just our survival, but our flourishing. This doesn't mean our modern world is perfect, or that we don't have serious challenges to face. But it means we have the tools, knowledge, and systems to approach these challenges in ways our ancestors couldn't even imagine. We have the capacity to learn from the past without needing to repeat its most brutal mistakes. The next time you feel you're having a bad day, remember this journey through ancient India. Remember that you live in an era where clean water flows from faucets, where medicines can cure diseases that killed entire empires, where information is instantly available, and that your basic rights are protected by legal systems that, despite being imperfect, represent thousands of years of social evolution. Human history is fundamentally a story of survival against impossible odds. Our ancestors faced challenges that would make our worst nightmares seem like fairy tales. And somehow, they not only survived, but created the foundations for the world we live in today. Your existence is the result of millions of small victories against mortality, diseases, hunger, and brutality that defined